Hey guys, HackerSploit here, back again with another video. Welcome back to the Linux security series. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to set up and configure the uncomplicated firewall, also known as UFW. Alright, so let me just give you a bit of a background as to what UFW is and how it works and its relation with IP tables. Now, UFW is a utility that is designed to simplify the setup and management of firewall rules, in more specific IP tables rules. Now, when I say that, essentially UFW allows you to very easily and very succinctly control, set up your various firewall rules. And the main utility or the tool that UFW uses to do this is IP tables, right? So we can actually get started immediately with it. As mentioned, we're going to be following the example we had set up in the beginning. So our job is to secure the development server that's currently running WordPress, and we're now within the stages of setting up a firewall. And again, we're going to be using UFW. So right over here, we have, if we try and access the web server, we can see that we can pretty much access any service on the target that's currently running. So in this case, we have the website running on port 80. And of course, I've been able to establish access using SSH. So the first thing we want to do is we want to ensure that we have UFW installed. Now, by default, UFW comes prepackaged and installed on Debian-based distributions, if I'm not mistaken, more specifically Ubuntu. Now, given that we are using Debian, we can confirm that we have it installed by saying sudo apt install UFW, and we hit enter. I'll just put in the password here, and you can see UFW is already the latest version. Of course, you can view the UFW man pages to get a bit more of a context as to what this tool is and what it's used for. So again, UFW is a program for managing a net filter firewall. This program is used for managing a Linux firewall and aims to provide an easy to use interface for the user. So that's really the crescendo of UFW, is that the fact that it gives you a very easy and understandable syntax to work with in regards to setting up your various firewall rules. That being said, we can actually go ahead and start taking a look at some of the most important commands. Now, the first thing you need to take into consideration is the fact that UFW is a service. Now, when we talk about services, you can start services, you can stop services, you can restart them, and you can enable them to actually be run on the system startup. And to do that, we can use the various init systems that come with Linux. In our case, we're using system control, and that's going to be the likely choice for most of you. So the first thing you want to do is before you go ahead and start setting up any of your rule sets, is you need to understand that, and you want to make sure that you do not enable the UFW service before you've set up your firewall rules, because it can actually lock you out. So that's something you want to take into consideration there. That being said, I'm just going to stop talking and we can actually get started. So we can run the command it does require root privileges. So we say sudo UFW, and we can take a look at the status, right? So the current status is telling us that it is active, and this is by default, I believe, with the this is the default scenario with this particular Linode. It does come with UFW set up, and of course you can see we have both IPv4 rules and IPv6 rules, and it's sorted out in the form of the protocol or the port and the action and from, or where the traffic is coming from. So for example, we have an SSH port, and that of course is TCP, and the action is set to allow. So that means SSH is allowed to connect to the server from any IP in the world, and so on and so forth for all the other various ports, port 80, port 443, port 25 for SMTP, port 587, 110, etc. And then of course the same is repeated for IPv6. Now, you can modify the default UFW configuration file by going into vim etc default, and we're looking for UFW, and I'll hit enter, and you can enable or disable IPv6 if you want that. it's recommended to have it running, which again, we'll leave it as it is. You can also set the default input policy to accept, drop, or reject if you want. And again, you can do that for the default output policy, the forward policy, the application policy, so on and so forth. So the configuration is fairly simple. It's fairly simple to set up. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to get rid of the current configuration. So if we take a look at the status, you can see the current status is active. So if we say sudo UFW disable, so we'll disable the service, and you can see it's going to tell us the firewall is stopped and disabled on system startup. If we take a look at the status one more time, it's now going to tell us that it's inactive, and that really hasn't affected anything in regards to what we can access, because even before, the rules were all set to give us access anyway. So it's always recommended when setting up a firewall, especially one on a server, to set up everything from scratch, because it's these type of rules that have been pre-configured for you that can really cause an issue, because you may forget to disable one, or you may have ones that you don't understand that are currently set up. So it's always good to start afresh. And to start afresh, we need to reset this. So we say sudo UFW reset, right? And that will reset all the setup rules, and it's going to tell us this may disrupt existing SSH connections. And it's going to ask us if we want to proceed with the operation. This is very important. So before you reset the rules, ensure that UFW is disabled so you still have access to the server. So I'm just going to hit yes, and that's going to delete it. And you can see it's going to back up the rules into user.rules, and it gives you the directory here. So that's just in case you want to revert back. So again, if we say sudo UFW status, you can see it's currently inactive, and we can then take a look at the web server. You can see it's still working. If we exit from here and we try and reconnect via SSH, we should be able to still have access, right? So I'll just set that up, and there we are. We still have access, and we had secured it with our SSH key. All right, excellent. So now we can actually get started by setting up the default policies. And this is recommended for every fresh configuration. So the default policies are as follows. The default policy for incoming connections is that we deny them, and the default policy for outgoing connections is that we allow them. So we'll set that up, and then after that, we'll start configuring our own rules. So we say sudo UFW, and we say default deny out incoming. So sudo UFW default deny incoming. And don't worry if that doesn't make sense. We'll be changing all of this, and we can then say sudo default allow outgoing, right? So we say allow outgoing, and remember, this is still what's happening is the UFW is currently disabled, so it's not going to affect anything as of yet. So if I try and restart the server, you can see we should still have access. If it does not work, and we can see that that's still working. If it doesn't work, what we can do is we can disable the service completely. So we can say sudo system control status UFW. It's going to tell us that it's loaded and active, so we can disable it in the meantime. So we can say stop, right? And we're going to have that stop. And again, that doesn't affect anything yet. So it's very important that you actually disable everything. You set your rules and then activate it and see if anything is causing any issues. So that's the first step here. And we've set up the default policies. The next thing we can take a look at is if we take a look and we see, we say sudo UFW status, we can display that. It's going to tell us it's inactive, so we can start adding our rules. So when adding your rules, when configuring your various rules for your firewall, it's very important that you understand what rules or what services you want to keep active in regards to incoming and outgoing connections, and what services and protocols you want to actually disable or prevent from being accessed. In our case, we know that the two essential protocols that we want to keep active are going to be HTTP, both on port 80 and port 443 for HTTPS, and port 22 for SSH. So to do that, we're going to say sudo UFW allow, and we can specify the protocol either by saying SSH or by the port number. In this case, we can simply just say SSH, hit enter. It's going to say rules updated for both IPv4 and IPv6. We can then say UFW status, and again, it's going to tell us it's inactive. And once we enable it or we start it, you'll actually list out with the various rules that we have. The next rule we want to allow is going to be HTTP. So that's both port 80 and HTTPS, even though we haven't configured an SSL certificate yet. So these are the most important rules. And of course, we can allow any other ports that we want. So for example, if I wanted to allow FTP, I can say FTP like so. And we don't have FTP running on the server, but again, we can do that as well. If we want to allow a particular connection from an IP address, like let's say we only want to allow or we want to allow a connection from a particular IP address explicitly, we can define that. So we can say sudo UFW allow, sorry, let me just correct the syntax here. So sudo UFW allow, and then we say from, and we list out the IP address right over here. So I can say 10.0.0.1, for example. I can do that right over here and hit enter. It's going to say rules updated. I can also specify I can also explicitly define a rule that allows a particular connection to a particular port. So let's say I deny all SSH connections, but I only allow an SSH connection from a particular IP to the SSH port. So to do that, I would simply say sudo UFW allow from the IP to any port 22. So sudo UFW allow from 10.0.0.1 to any port 22, right? And hit enter, and that rule is updated. And I can also do this for any other port or any other IP. I can also specify an entire subnet, and it's very important when specifying IP addresses to ensure that the IP addresses that you'll be using or that you're setting within your rules, these IPs have to be static and not dynamic. Because if you set up your firewall to allow connections from your IP address and your IP address changes, then you'll not get access because the rule has been set for that IP alone. So you can also set subnets if you want. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just simply showing you how to do this. So that's essentially all your rules that will allow these particular services that we've stated explicitly. Now, after we've done this, we don't want to deny anything yet because by default, all incoming connections have been set to deny. That was the default policy configuration that we set up earlier. So what we can do is we can say sudo system control start, and we say UFW. And we can then say sudo UFW enable, like so. And it's going to say this may disrupt existing SSH connections. I'm going to hit yes. And the firewall is active and enabled. If we now say sudo UFW status and we hit enter, it'll now going to list the various rules that we have configured. So you can see that for port 22, that is set to allow, port 80 set to allow, port 443 allow, port 21 allow, and then we are allowing any connection from this IP right over here, which is kind of a useless rule. I was just adding it there so you can understand what's going on. And then of course we allow all connections to port 22 from this particular IP. So if we try and access our web server now, we should have access to it immediately, like so. And again, the reason I'm doing this is just to show you that it is working. So if I try and connect via SSH here, you can see that works as well. So that is how to allow or how to set rules to allow connections. If we want to start denying connections to services, we can say, for example, let me just say sudo UFW. And if we want to list out the rules and delete certain rules, we can say UFW status numbered. We can list out the various the numbering for all of these rules, and then we can say sudo UFW delete and then specify a rule number. So in our case, what we can do now is we can start getting rid of rule 5 and rule 6. So sudo UFW, and we say delete delete rule 5, right? So delete rule 5 because we don't need that. And looks like we have an issue. Sudo UFW delete, and we just specify the option 5 here, and it's going to say deleting. Yes, we want to do that. And we then take a look at the status again. We then want to disable rule 5 again because it's moved upwards one more time. So we hit enter, that's going to delete that. And now if we take a look at the status again, you can see the only rules that we have are going to be port 22. So that is allowing SSH connections. We then have port 80, which allows HTTP connections, port 443, port 21, which is FTP. So we can also get rid of port 21 because we do not have FTP running, so we can delete that. And now it's becoming much more clearer. So just for an example, if I want to deny all connections to the web server, I can do that very simply by first of all listing out, and I can say I want to delete the rule 22, or sorry, the rule 2, not 22. So I can delete that, and that's port 80 for HTTP. And if I try and reload the web server now, we'll just wait for that to reload here, and you can see I have no connection coming back. So that means again, within the firewall, I've configured no access or no incoming access for the port 80. And you might be wondering, well, we haven't actually configured that manually. The reason that is the case is because when we were configuring the default policy lists, by default, if you remember, what happened is we configured all incoming connections, or we configured the firewall to deny all incoming connections unless we explicitly define otherwise, or we explicitly allow it manually. In our case, we allowed only port 22, port 80, port 443 manually. So those are the only ones that are going to be working. So again, if I list out the status one more time, if I now enable it, so I say sudo UFW enable HTTP and hit enter. Sorry, sudo not enable, we want to allow it, my bad. The syntax is much more simpler. So allow, and it's going to add the rule. And if we now try and refresh the web server, you can see it now works. Now we can also allow, as I said, from a particular IP. So if I only want to allow my IP address access to that particular to the web server, what I can do is I can get my my public IP address. So what's my IP, and I can just copy that, and of course I can then just go back into my terminal here, and if I list out the rules, because I want to delete the rule that allows all connections. So for example, if I go into the status here, and I want to delete this rule number 3 because that's allowing any connection to the port 80. So we want to get rid of that and then explicitly define that only my IP has access to that port. So I'll say sudo UFW delete port 80, right? So we can get rid of that. Sorry, not port 80, option number 3. And we're going to hit yes. And then we want to say, we can then say sudo UFW allow from IP. So sudo UFW allow from IP, and we can then paste the IP in here, right? So allow from to any port 80, right? And we hit enter, and that's going to add it. So you can see now it's going to work. If I refresh this, I'll still have access, and that's because I'm trying to access it with my ID, with my IP address. If I delete that rule, so I'll just list the status numbered, and I delete this rule right over here, you can see it allows only my IP. So I'll just say sudo UFW delete, and that is rule 3, and I hit enter. There we are, and I try and refresh this. You should now see that we have no access to the web server, and I can then re-enable the rule that allows any IP address to access it. So this is a great way for IP or administrators of on the web server to actually disable access to the particular website, and only they can access it because they have their own IP. And as I said, a note of caution is ensure that you have a static IP. Otherwise, if your IP address changes or you go to a different location with a different IP address, you'll not be able to access it. So you want to keep that in mind. I generally don't recommend running these rules. So again, we just say sudo UFW allow HTTP, hit enter, and that's just going to allow anyone to access it. So if we list the numbered rules, that's pretty much fine for me right now. So if I refresh that, we still have access. So again, you can see how easy it is and how important it is to configure your rules yourself and to understand what's going on. Now, as I said, on this particular web server, the only services we need running are going to be SSH and the web server. And we've talked about securing SSH We've talked about securing the web server. We can also limit SSH access to our IP. And to do that, all I would need to do is just delete the SSH rule here, and then specify, I can just say sudo UFW allow from my IP address to the port 22, and that will only allow my IP address to connect via SSH. So that's fairly simple. And of course, I can deny any particular service. So I can say here sudo UFW deny instead of allow. So sudo UFW deny FTP. So I can deny all FTP connections, all FTP incoming connections if I want. I can also say another service like HTTP. If I say sudo UFW deny HTTP and I hit enter, I can do that as well. So allowing and denying is very, very simple. If I want to deny from a particular IP, I can also do that sudo UFW deny from, and I specify the IP. So deny from, I can put in my IP right over here, and I can then say to any particular service, or just deny all connections from this particular target. So I can do that right here. So you sudo UFW deny from, and then paste in my IP. And if I try and access the web server, I should, let me just restart that. There we are. Looks like we cannot connect. If I go back and I try and exit out of SSH here, and I try and reestablish an SSH connection, you can see I don't have access. So I've fundamentally or essentially just locked myself where I actually got access back. And that's because if I say sudo UFW status numbered, there we are. Just paste in my password. You can see that it's going to allow any SSH connection. And if we delete that, you can see once I delete that particular rule, it's going to deny all connections, and I can then explicitly state a port that I want. So that's essentially how to deny connections. If we want to delete rules, as I said, we can say sudo UFW delete. We can get rid of, let's see, rule number 5, because we don't need that. Hit yes. Do we need rule 4? We can actually just get rid of rule 4 because I don't think we need that. That is deny port 21 FTP, yes. And then we can get rid of rule 3. So we just get rid of rule 3, and we can then just say sudo UFW allow HTTP and hit enter. That's going to allow our web server. So we now have access to the web server. There we are, and we also have access via SSH. So the key thing to take into consideration here, allowing and denying rules, is very simple. Just know what services and ports you want to keep active, the ones you want to allow connections to, and the ones you actually want to protect from active connections. You can specify the IP addresses you want to block. You can specify the IP addresses you want to allow in, but with that, you want to make sure that you're not specifying a dynamic IP address that can then later lock you out. If you're working with Linode or any other cloud provider, you also have the ability to get yourself out of trouble using the console here. The console gives you a terminal within your browser, so you can reestablish access that way, and it does not use SSH by default. So you can actually just get access. So if I say root and here enter my password, which we had actually disabled root through SSH, but you can see I now have access to the root account. So that's a great way to, save yourself or rescue yourself if you're ever in a situation where you've mucked up a firewall and you've locked yourself out. So it's always good to have that handy. So setting rules, very, very simple. If you want to reset UFW, you can do that as well. So I can say sudo, let me just list the status. So sudo UFW status. It's going to tell us it's active. We can say sudo UFW reset. That's going to get rid of all your rules. So if you make a mistake, you can reset all of those mistakes by just hitting enter. I'm going to hit yes, and it's going to back up all of your rules. If we take a look at the status, you can see it's going to tell us it's inactive. When you if you hit reset, it's going to turn it off. And again, there we are. If we refresh this, we'll still have access to the site because the firewall is now enabled. It's now disabled. So a few things I want to make clear. Ensure that you set up your default policies first. then explicitly define the policies you want to allow in terms of the connections. You can also define the ones you want to deny, then enable the firewall, and then you can test it out that way. So UFW is very, very simple to understand. It's very intuitive. And it all revolves around what you want to do or how you want to configure your server. So that's going to be it for this video.